Hi, everybody. I'm Sam Marshall. I've been asked to ask you guys to turn off your cell phones and to not record. It's being recorded, so you can see it in the GDC vault. So thanks so much for coming. Like, I see some familiar faces and some not familiar faces, and maybe like medium familiar faces. So let me give you a little bit of background on Concrete Genie. So Concrete Genie is a game made by developer Pixel Opus. We're a small first-party title at Sony, and Concrete Genie is a game about a young artist called Ash, who discovers a magic paintbrush, and he uses this magic paintbrush to bring his paintings to life. So this is literally what you do as the player in the game. You use the DualShock 4, you make these marks on the walls, and they animate into these beautiful paintings. You also paint these cool creatures, add all kinds of attachments to them, bring them to life, and they become your companions throughout the game. So he uses this magic paint to restore and revive this once flourishing but now kind of abandoned and decrepit fishing port town. But unfortunately, there are a group of neighborhood kids that bully Ash and destroy his artwork. And for me, Concrete Genie is a game about growing up. It's about overcoming adversity through creative expression and a little bit of magic too. So I was the composer on their first game, Entwined, and just kind of incidentally, music kind of became a big part of that game. It's if I do say so, it's a big part of this game as well. So no pressure, Sam. And I was really lucky to be brought on really early in this project. I've been working on this project for nearly 4 years. So I was able to go through a concept music phase alongside the artists doing their concept art and the designers making prototype. Which is really cool and kind of a new thing. I'm used to the gig where it's like, oh crap, we need music. We're shipping in 4 months, and you have to write a whole soundtrack in kind of a short amount of time. So that was really a privilege. Because I worked with this team before, I was given a good amount of time to kind of experiment and iterate and try some things, and I was also allowed the luxury of a little bit of failure, which I'm going to share with you guys today. I knew going into it what I didn't want to do, and I didn't want to do orchestral music. And the only reason I bring this up is because I feel like this is a sound that we default to in games a lot. And don't get me wrong, there are plenty of games where orchestral music is absolutely the right choice. But I play a lot of games where there's this big bombastic orchestral music, and it's just wrong. It just doesn't work. And guys, I turn off the music a lot in games. And when the music is not right, I turn that off. How awful is that? The personal connection that I wanted to create between that character and the player just required a more intimate ensemble. It required soloists. And that doesn't mean the music doesn't get big, but that intimacy is always there. Honestly, it was just a better texture for the world. This isn't a giant, big, sprawling RPG. It's a very personal story about a young boy in a small town. So a smaller ensemble, again, was a better texture for that world. And this is kind of a hindsight thing. It turns out that when you don't have these really expensive recording sessions, you have a lot more flexibility in your music. So for instance, we can do a lot of smaller sessions with soloists, and that way, we have a big deadline coming up, we can get in some recording sessions and mix sessions in for that deadline. Or if you're towards the end of a project, awesome, there's some new music, cool, we can just bring in a couple soloists and we can mix it, and it can happen really quickly. Orchestral sessions are super expensive, and they need to be planned out way ahead of time. So if there's additional music that comes in late, they might end up as mock-ups, which is not optimal. During this music kind of conception phase, I wrote a lot of music. I wrote about 40 minutes of music, and some of it was kind of ideas, and some were fully realized pieces, some were just kind of little scenarios, some were ideas and sketches and things like that. And I may be alone here, but I actually don't like writing sketches. Are there any composers who don't like writing sketches? 0, not one. Maybe 1 or 2. And the reason is because I'm not a composer who has the whole thing in their head. I really need to get inside of the instruments. The ensemble is a big inspiration for me. Even if it's a virtual instrument, I need to get in there and feel it out. So if you don't like writing sketches, you're not alone. And I'll wrap around back on this a little bit later. So I wrote 40 minutes of music and covering a pretty wide range of styles, and I was kind of really honing in on this idea that this town is really decrepit, and like this kid is really lonely. He's kind of like this, tortured artist sort of character, and guys, so out of the 40 minutes that I wrote, none of it was approved, like zero. All of it was rejected, all of it. Not one moment was right for the project. And I was like, I tried a bunch of different things, tried a bunch of different ensembles. Like, what am I doing wrong? I've worked with these guys before. Like, what is going on here? They were really nice about it. It was basically like, hey, try again. But honestly, I was really bummed out and a little bit confused. And so I was talking to the music producer at the time, John, about this like music review that didn't go super well. And he said to me, Sam, where's the magic in your score? And like, I'm already feeling down, and I'm thinking he's being rhetorical. Like, where's the X factor in your score? But no, he was being really literal. He's like, where's the magic in your score? Like, this game's all about a magic brush. There's no magic in your score. There's no like playfulness. There's no wonder. Where's the magic? And then I realized, like, man, I've just been approaching this completely the wrong way. Like, I've been going by all these like kind of feelingsy things, like, oh, maybe I should do this, or maybe I should try that, or let me just try a bunch of things, and maybe something will stick. And honestly, I was kind of taking for granted the fact that I had worked with them before, and that that I had a rapport. So I was like, okay, I'm being too abstract. I'm being too feelingsy. I need to get like more literal and like more deliberate and more intent. And that's kind of the theme of this talk, is like intent in what you're doing. And so this is an exercise that we go through a lot with composers at the Sony Music Department, where we figure out what are the important like narrative or emotional themes of a game. And then we use that for inspiration for the score. They call I don't know if any of you saw Scott and Rob's talk on the music of Spider-Man. They call it emotional tentpoles. I call them musical pillars. We're all talking about the same shit. And so I was like, all right, I'm going to identify 3 big, important musical pillars of Concrete Genie. I'm going to give them names, and I'm going to go one step further, and I'm going to assign musical instruments to them. And hopefully, if I make the right choices, my template will inspire me. Because again, I'm really inspired by the ensemble. The instruments kind of tell me what to write. So what are the musical pillars of Concrete Genie? So the first one I identified was childhood, right? Like playfulness, innocence, this joy of creativity. Our game's really cool, and we have basically an all-kid cast. So our game's like all about youth. I'm thinking about it, I'm like, okay, what's the most, again, being really literal, being really intent. What's the like most youthful instrument I can think of? Oh, it's the flute, right? It's like, it's so pure, it's just fun, it's playful. And it's funny, through this process, I've come across some people who have kind of an allergic reaction to flute. Because yes, it can be very cheesy if done that way. But kind of digging in, I realized that it's actually a really expressive instrument. And if with enough recording prowess behind it, it can be really breathy and really emotional and smooth. It just kind of worked. And, the flute is it's not often a main player in a score. And so that was kind of interesting to me. I was like, okay, this is a little bit of a road less traveled. That's kind of cool. And plus, Concrete Genie, kind of a bonus, Concrete Genie takes place in a fishing port town. So like, I don't know where this reference is pointing to, but something about the flute reminds me of kind of a seafaring nautical thing. So great, cool, we're gonna hint at that. All right, cool, 1 down, 2 to go. So the next one I identified was overcoming struggle. And I was kind of like hinting at this with like the whole, oh, I'm a lonely kid and I live in a shitty town. But really there was 2 parts to it. There was like, I'm a lonely kid and I get bullied, but I overcome it. And this is a really crappy place to live, but I'm reviving it and making it better. So it was actually twofold. So what goes with that? It's like the bullying, growing up, kind of impending adulthood, doing the right thing is a big part of Concrete Genie. And so there's a maturity that goes with it. And I'm like, okay, cool, childhood maturity. I think we're onto something. And this one was easy, right? The cello. The cello is like a super mature instrument. It's super expressive, can cover such a wide range of emotions. It's no surprise that like the cello is like a film scoring and game scoring staple. And so that was appealing to me too. It's like we have this kind of flute, which is kind of not used that often as like a main focus in a score, and a cello, which is used all the time. So I feel like there's a nice balance there. Cool. All right, 2 down, 1 to go. And the last one was magic. Like how silly of me to think that I like wouldn't represent magic in the score. Like, that would be crazy. So the living paint, that's what we call the paint in our world, the wonder, the otherworldliness. And guys, I'll tell you what I didn't want to do. I didn't want to do like harp and like wizard shit, right? Because that wasn't right for this project. So I'm like, okay, let's go the complete opposite direction. I have a pretty sweet analog polysynth collection that I've been dying to use for something. And so I was like, okay, let's try this. Analog polysynths. And so it turns out Concrete Genie is really influenced by like coming of age 80s movies with, a little bit of fantasy in them. And so kind of nodding to that old, 80s style of like a synthy film score without getting too retro, because honestly, I wouldn't do a good job of a retro score. It just kind of worked. And it ended up being a really nice contrast to the really worldly themes of like the flute and the cello. We have like childhood and adulthood, these really human things, and then magic, and it's like the synth on top of it. And again, the synths are like, they are a player in the ensemble. They're not just like, it's not just a texture. Like, they're an actual player. And it's definitely a fine line. Anything that was like too digital or too like FM leaning was just like too sci-fi or robot-like. Like, I had to kind of check myself at every corner. But anything that was big and warm and kind of pitch wavery and felt like it was alive seemed to work. And the great analog filters with their kind of like goopy bubbliness to them just seemed to represent the paint in the world really well. Okay, so now I'm like really excited about this because I freaking love synths. And so here's the big takeaway, guys, is that after like clearly identifying like these important themes of Concrete Genie, giving them names, and using them for emotional, narrative, and technical inspiration, I went on to write the first real theme of Concrete Genie. And the team loved it. Approved, first try. And the reason is because there was a lot of intent behind it. I wasn't just doing a shotgun blast of like, oh, let's try this, oh, this feels good, blah, blah, blah. No, there was like very literal, very deliberate intention in what I was doing. So I'm gonna play just a kind of a short edit of that theme for you guys. So I'll tell you guys, I really like that little cello thing at the end, because all the composers out there will know this, know what I'm talking about. It works over everything in the game. Like, I use it in a gajillion cutscenes, like that idea, and I think that's like the gold mine. Like, that's the holy grail, is when you find that phrase that just works over everything. Like, it works over a big magic moment, it works over like a really tender moment, it works over like a really sad moment. So that's kind of how I knew I was onto something interesting. And so great, now we have the seed to grow the rest of the score, and every cue in Concrete Genie has those three elements in it: the flute, the cello, and the analog synths. So the second part of this is talking about music implementation and interactivity. So I'm also the music integrator on the project, and this is I've never been on a project so long as a music integrator, and so I've learned a lot of things, and so I want to share them with you today. But first, I want to talk about the brush chimes. So this is something I'm really proud of. So the brush chimes are this musical sound effects that play when the player paints, so this is like interactive music in its purest form. It's like you push a button and music comes out. And this was an idea that came from our director, Dom. He was like, we need a way to incentivize painting. We need a way to encourage the player to paint with different brushes and paint all the time and paint all over the place. And so we came up with this system. And so all 50 plus brushes in the game all have their basically own little virtual instrument that plays when you paint. So here, I'll give you a little demo. I'll kind of talk over it. And this is all work in progress, so anything that sounds great is intentional, and anything that sounds bad, I'm working on. That was a joke. So some of the brushes, have a little scale that randomizes. Some actually play specific melodies. Some start with a loop while you're holding it and then have a finish sound. Some only have a finish sound. And the cool thing about these is that they will play nice with the music that's actually playing. So they'll tempo sync with the music. They will play in the right chord, in the right key. They'll meter change with the music. So the player can feel like they're actually jamming along with the soundtrack. And throughout making this, I realized that making music is actually a really novel thing to non-musicians. I mean, you guys are all musicians. Most of you are musicians, I assume. And so this is not that interesting to us. But to somebody who doesn't play music, to be able to jam along with a soundtrack, it's actually really cool. Just in the same way that I'm not an artist and I can feel like I can create awesome art in this game pretty effortlessly. I wanted to do that for the player on the music side. So it's a little music game hidden in this painting game. So I'll go over a quick overview of how it works, right? So if you imagine this is a piece of Explore music or something like that, right? And we have the tempo and the meter up at the top. And so basically what I do is you have a MIDI file that's synchronized with your music, right? It's starts and ends at the same time. They're the same tempo, and there's no note data in that MIDI file. It's just tempo, meter data, and then all of these MIDI markers, right? You can see the markers there. And what the MIDI markers do is that's what tells the Scream, the software we use, the proprietary Sony software, that you should be in this chord or you should be in that chord. So this is not a super complicated thing. It's basically with a little bit of back-end programming, anybody can do this. It's just a MIDI file basically that it's reading. And one thing I found was that if you put those markers, those chord change markers, just a little bit before the chord change, like a beat or two before, you kind of get a lead-in, you get a modulation essentially, because some of those borrowed notes from this chord are happening over this chord. So it just kind of feels fun and feels nice. It really feels like you're jamming with the soundtrack. So back to some more just nuts and bolts music implementation stuff. Again, I learned a lot, and one question that I was kind of always asking myself was, does it need to loop, right? Because looping music is kind of a game music, 101 thing. It's that's what you do. You have an intro, and you have your loop, and then you have your end tag, or you have your transition, right? But I was kind of always asking myself, why does it need to loop? And so in Concrete Genie, the only time that I loop music is if there's a puzzle or an objective to get through, or tutorial is a great time to loop music, right? It's and I'll use a really short loop for a tutorial, and I don't care if the player knows it's a loop, because I'm trying to push them to the next objective. So you have that really short loop, between these mini objectives, and then they finish this thing, and boom, I transition to another loop, and this becomes, ta-da, a functional piece of gameplay feedback. It actually serves a gameplay purpose. There's intent behind it, right? It's not just looping because you're supposed to loop. And so, another reason that I only use loops when I feel like they have a function is because I hate it. This is my biggest pet peeve, is when music is constantly interrupting other music, right? And so this is fine for something like Spider-Man, where you have traversal music, and then you have combat music, and then you're back to traversal, and then you're jumping into a cutscene, and then you're talking to an NPC. The kind of the nature of that big, grand, bombastic film score style music. We're used to hearing a lot of changing and switchings and crazy fills and things like that in that style of music. But in Concrete Genie, all the music is really mellow and pretty subdued, and some of it's really solemn. And so making all those transitions work is actually really tricky because you don't have a big cymbal swipe to cover up your fades, right? And that's pretty much what we're trying to do when we're like doing music transitions, right? It's like we're fading out one and we're like trying to get another one in. So you like really hear those fades and you really hear that switching. And for that, it throws me off. And so what I do is if I know that there's like, so here's the beginning of the level, right? And if I know there's some other music event here and I want to play explore music here, let's say this event is like about 10 minutes away, I'll cut like a 5-minute loop. Or excuse me, not loop, just a one-shot, like a big explore one-shot that kind of just sneaks in and then sneaks out. And maybe, I guess if you're a speedrunner, you might get to that music event. Oh, well, the speedrunner doesn't get the sweet music transition. But the important part about that is that like it sneaks in and it also sneaks out. Because if you end music kind of abruptly, that can send the wrong message too. And so that brings me to my next point, which is like letting your music end. And like I see this in AAA games and indie games like where there's just like it's just loop after loop after loop after loop, and there's this weird fear of like ending the music and being in silence. Do you ever like really like you're watching a movie or a TV show and you really like pay attention to when the music is coming and going? Like it comes and goes all the time, and we as the viewers don't even notice. And I feel like as integrators and as directors and developers, we kind of get it in our heads that like, oh, there's no music here, we need to put music here. Oh crap, like there's silence. And so that brings me to my next point, which is like fight for silence. Like as composers, this may seem like contradictory, but we need silence. Silence is a compositional choice, right? And I'm not talking about like John Cage. Like that's not the same thing. That guy's a troll. So like, silence creates space for your music to be most impactful, right? You need contrast in order for your music to be most impactful. And again, kind of like I was saying earlier, I call this a rookie mistake, but I see this in AAA games, and I see it in indie games, and I see it in mobile games. I see it all across the board, is there's just too much music, so much music. And it's one of the jobs of music is to tell you what's important. And if there's music all the time, it just becomes unimportant. And you've lost that functionality in your music. You've lost a really important piece of functionality in your music. So I have a really extreme example, and anybody who knows me is going to be like, of course you did. But like these games, right? These games, there's no explore music in these games. Zero. There's no like cool combat music system. Nothing. You can play this game for like hours of silence, of zero music. And then there's the craziest music you've ever heard during the boss fight, right? And I don't recommend that you guys do this, right? Because this is kind of their thing. But it's serving such a powerful gameplay and emotional and narrative function here. If you want a pro tip for playing these games, turn off the music when you're fighting a boss. That boss fight is so much easier without the music. Like we underestimate how much like real fear, real dread, and real difficulty we're bringing into the game with just the music alone. Again, this is serving such a super powerful gameplay function here. Okay, so we have an ambient music system in our game. And so what do you do if your director is like, and I love him to death, but if he's like, Sam, we want more music in the game. And I'm like, well, I want less music in the game. What do you do, right? So what I did was I built an ambient music system in order to kind of like mitigate, I don't want to call it a compromise. It's kind of to mitigate the silence. And so again, instead of having like a series of loops that play one after another, I built a music system that plays subtle ambient music when the player does like, certain nonlinear goals. So, and it's all kind of a dice roll, right? There's like a chance that it'll play some ambient music. So like if you paint a creature, like there's a dice roll that it'll play some ambient music. If you're like clearing a darkness zone, the game's all about restoring a town, so you clear these zones of darkness and you light the town back up. Then there's a chance that it'll play some music. If you collect a page, right, you collect these brushes throughout the game, so if you collect one, there's a chance that like a little bit of ambient music will play. Or if just music hasn't played for a generous amount of time, and I think I have it, right now I have it set, it's a work in progress, but right now I have it set to like 3 or 4 minutes or something like that. So at least I'll get 3 or 4 minutes of silence somewhere. And so I set up a logic, or we set up a logic that says like, there are literally 2 different scripts. There's like play ambient music, and there's play music. And play ambient music. Ambient music will never interrupt regular music. That's the rule. So like ambient music won't like start randomly playing during a cutscene or something like that. But music will always interrupt ambient music. And here's the good news, guys, is that the ambient music can be interrupted without driving me fucking crazy. And so the system, what it does is it'll like play a short one shot of like a flute or a cello, right? Remember those guys? And then like a long ambient one shot. Again, all one shots, right? A long ambient one shot would just kind of sneak in and sneak out. Again, like the sneaking in and sneaking out is important here. And so if the player is really active in the game and they're doing a lot of things and they're running around and they're painting a lot. There's also, even when you start painting, there's a dice roll that it'll play ambient music. So if you cue a lot of these in a row, they'll kind of like, they'll sort of stack on top of each other and they will tempo sync to each other because some of them are rhythmic. And so basically, like if you do a lot in the game, you'll get a thicker ambient bed, but it's still pretty subtle. And I did set up a rule that no more than 3 ambient beds can play on top of each other because then it just kind of gets messy and weird. And so again, this is a great way to fill the silence without an overbearing amount of music. And this music can be interrupted, and I'm cool with it. So I just kind of illustrated this in Pro Tools. This wouldn't happen this often because, again, it's a dice roll. It'd be a pretty slim chance that it would happen, that you get this much music. But just to illustrate what's going on here. So you have like a little one shot. The red regions are one shots. And then here's your ambient layer. And so let's say the player wins another dice roll, right? And that cello thing will sync to the, to the bar. And this ambient loop will sync to this bar of this one too. They're all tempo synced. So we won another dice roll, great. And so on this fourth one, because we have more than 3, the first one, the oldest one, will just fade out. And these stingers here, and it's like, okay, interesting, we just kind of had like a little bit of a mood switch here. And so these stingers kind of serve 2 functions, right? They kind of punctuate the, the moment, but they also serve to cover up this fade, right? Because that's what we want to do. We want our transitions to cover up fades. Cool. All right, well, that's all I've got for you guys. Thank you so much. So again, the big takeaway here is like intent, right? We want to learn from my mistakes. We want to have good reasons why we're doing something. So if we're going to write orchestral music, we should have good reasons why we're doing it. If we're going to do this style of music or that, we should have a good reason. If we're going to use this instrument, there should be a reason that's connected to the emotion and the narrative of the game. If we're going to loop music, have a good reason. If you're going to have silence, have a good reason. So thank you so much for coming. I guess I don't know if we have enough time for any questions. I'll be around if you guys want to talk after the show or after the talk. Thank you so much. Happy Friday, and if you're traveling, travel safe.